unlike my last video, which probably is uploading the same day, but possibly yesterday, this one is actually attainable. In all likelihood, well, you don't really know until you try it, but, sorry, I had a tingle in my hair. Well, you can't really tell, because it's dark, so it's still in my waist. AI art steals. So, conventionally, and historically, history looks down upon the people who, have taken without asking. I mean, they usually rule the world, but they're very much disliked. Um, and that's AI art right now. Additionally, AI art has a problem with counting fingers, which they've ironed out, but kind of with a brute force approach that isn't 100%. And I've noticed a lot of AI models don't have a lot of data on how to draw manta rays, and that makes me sad because manta rays are like the coolest animal. They're the only vertebrate in the real, like, living current animal kingdom with 6 fully functional limbs. Because you know how, like, an elephant an elephant nose is, like, technically a 5th limb? Well, manta rays have little mouth flaps, but they have 2, which makes them the only animal that isn't a bug, that, like, has a spinal cord and a central nervous system, and has 6 limbs. They're the closest thing to dragons that we have on this planet. Sort of like how, praying mantises, what is it with the word mant, and being, like, the coolest animal? Anyways, praying mantises are the closest thing we have to centaurs on the planet because they have, like, 2 walking legs and then, like, 2 grabbing legs. I mean, they have 2 pairs of walking legs and then 1 pair of grabbing legs, just like a centaur. But anyways, AI has trouble being anatomically correct with humans, let alone other animals. Like, have you ever tried asking AI to generate a trilobite? It usually generates like a weird sci-fi creature, like some kind of like spiky like snail or something. It doesn't like understand the anatomy of a trilobite, which really bugs me because it's not complicated. It's a Cambrian animal. It's got like dragonfly eyes, right? And then lots of little like shrimp legs and then like a little like tail. It's not the hardest thing in the world to draw, but for an AI, it just doesn't understand. Um, which bugs me. So yeah, and then I wish I was screen recording instead of filming an awkward selfie cam. So I'm gonna do jump cut to me screen recording instead of doing an awkward selfie cam. So the audio cut out here, but I said I'm in a couple AI art groups, but I forgot if they're private or not. So I'm not gonna like show any of the comments or anything. Um, but I asked, should I leave the group? And then I wrote a rant, and I'll read it to you. But the rant explains my position on everything wrong with generative AI right now. But I have a solution. It's just not one that well, we'll get into that because it might actually be a cool solution if we work together. I said I joined because I was into generating images and photoshopping them into my ideas, but the data in most, if not all, of these AI models is from people who did not consent to having their data in the AI models. It gives me flashbacks to history class, the scary parts of history class, because people who take without asking are not remembered fondly, except for people like Thomas Edison. But even then, though, like, we don't all think of him as a good person anymore. He paid to have good publicity, and then it ran out after he died. So yeah, the AI mimics the final result, but art is like a murder scene. A sufficiently talented detective should be able to see the crime taking place in their mind, because the crime scene, or the art in this case, leaves little hints, little clues, even if the artist or the criminal tried to make it look perfect. But AI art doesn't worry about how the crime took place, it skips to the carnage, for better or for worse. But when it bases that carnage off of proprietary intel, which it didn't have clearance to store or reproduce, well, I think the victims or the next of kin of those crimes would be uncomfortable with the artificially generated carnage, since the AI is fine tuned to composite. Oh, since the carnage is a fine tuned composite of their own and several other crime scenes. But again, on its own, it is not. What it generates is not a crime scene. Because unlike a Sherlock Holmes story, the author did not plan ahead about where to hide the clues at the beginning of the story. The clues literally don't exist. It's just broken and gruesome, but in a weird Alice in Wonderland way, which doesn't feel a need to take order into account. That is the difference between a human and an AI. AI, no matter what, like currently, no matter what it renders, uses the same technique. It starts with noise and it coheres it into an image. AI learns what, but not how. Humans learn how, and along the way, sometimes they decide not to care so much about what anymore. As an artist of both mediums, um, when I'm drawing, sometimes I get bored and I switch ideas midway through. Like when I'm like actually drawing, not AI. A similar thing happens when I just type random stuff into the AI prompt and it gets it wrongish, and but I decide I like the result, and so I keep the wrong answer because it's interesting. That said, though, when I draw it myself, I think about how to add or incorporate or alter things already drawn or that I wish to draw. There's an emphasis on how it goes in, and I decide whether I want the new elements to blend with what I've already drawn or to clash with it. AI, again, doesn't worry about it. New elements usually clash unless you add a prompt, unless you, as a prompt whisperer, can configure them to match the vibes. So, to recap, AI is not theoretically bad, similar to how communism leads to world peace on paper, but in practice, both of them are easily corrupted. And then I asked the group what they thought, and only one person has commented so far, but like I said, I'm not going to show comments because, So, yeah, that. Now let's go back to the awkward selfie cam, and I will explain my cool idea. Okay, so we've discussed what's wrong with AI, and now here's for the cool idea. Um, well, I'm trying not to drop my phone on my face. All right, so the idea would be image models require language, like we already know that. But the problem is both image models and language models are super shady about where they get that language. Um, so audio got funny again, but I'm about to say if we had a grassroots movement. We had a grassroots effort to build our own AI, and I'm pretty sure there have been several. Um, but maybe not to this like quality standard, I'm not sure. Basically the problem is you need to compensate people for their work, but if it's grassroots, that means it has $0. Usually, unless it's got a cool backer. Um, but the art idea is really cool, but first we have to tackle the language idea so the art can have something to build off of. Um, so right now I'm going to describe an LLM and how we could let grassroots describe it, and also it would be intrinsically instruction tuned. Um, all right. First of all, in order to compensate the people who contribute, they would like sign up to a newsletter. They would be able to donate to the project if they so choose, and they would have access to every snapshot of the AI model that is trained as it is being trained and fine-tuned, so that they can like fork their own like variants, and it would just belong to the community. That like the entire world, it would be free to the entire world, but especially the community that contributes would have access to it, like to its various like nuanced versions. um So with that out of the way, we would have like a forum with a disclaimer, and everyone on that forum would take up a role, and we would role play either as the instruction giver or the instruction receivers. And then with each receiver, we would just let anybody comment, sort of like a Quora forum. Specifically, we're role playing as someone using ChatGPT and as ChatGPT giving a good response. Um, and then we'd kind of like mark those responses um, on a scale of like 0 to 5. Um, and that would be for the casual discussion. So each initial response would then take you to like a a chat where only the instructor and the responder are allowed to talk, but it's not a private chat. It's public, but only those two have speaking permissions. Um, sorry, my cat's zooming around. It distracted me. Only those two have speaking permissions, and this would be like casual instruction. So, like, I ask Chat GPT, what's 2 plus 2? Well, actually, I think we should ban math equations, or not ban them, but we should have like a JSON format, and we should participants should be filed into 2 groups, okay? Programming, like techies, and eventually we're gonna need artists, but right now just techies and normies. Okay, so normies aren't allowed to answer math questions because we also have a JSON format that the AI is going to respond to, and like a hidden prompt, and you can learn about that in like the FAQ for like the technical FAQ, because AI needs like a prompt at the very beginning, and it can be like modular just to like get it started. Um, and so if we like structure it in a specific way, we can also like train it to respond differently when we alter that initial structure. But anyway, so JSON is a it's kind of like an Excel format, but like a little bit more nuanced. And yeah, so we we specifically have like a JSON like cheat sheet for I haven't decided yet, but I think there's like an API for like an open assistant. Um, API stands for Application Programming Interface, and the Open Assistant API is just like hard coded things you have to do like the smarts, but the tools are already there. There's like lots of toolkits for like making it work like an Alexa. So basically we'd have JSON to interface with our toolkit of choice, which I haven't like weighed pros and cons, and I don't think I'm qualified to do that. So if you want to help me like pick a toolkit because you like this idea, like we can. The problem is it needs to be set up and organized, and I have executive function issues. But so there's JSON for a toolkit, and the reason that normies aren't allowed to answer math equations is because why bother teaching the LLM to understand um, math when we can instead teach it to use a calculator? And that's what the JSON's for. It's for the calculator. Um, but that's just the LLM portion. Once we have the casual interaction and the hold on. No, I just realized the LLM does need like an internal representation of numbers going up to like at least 50. So normies are allowed to answer math equation questions, but there will be techies later. So never mind. Everybody's allowed to answer it just casual. And the JSON is irrelevant currently. But then we get to step 2, which is why I was confused, because step 2 is very similar. In step 2, we have normies and we have techies. Now, in step 2, we have a focus on sequential dialogue and tool use. So, with the tool use, we should decide something important, which I'm about to. We should decide whether we want the LLM to only be compatible with one particular tool use, which is lame, or decide if we want like a specific format for describing the tools, because we could train the LLM to be good at using retrieval augmented generation, but that's like a complicated thing that I don't understand as much. Or we could just have a base model that has like a large window, and we could just give it the pattern of the JSON and the list of JSON tools and their like options in like a text file. Not sure on that. Sorry, head's foggy. It's nap time. But in step 1, once we get enough like single question and answer style responses, we put that in the training data in pairs. And then the AI gets trained on the questions and the responses only. But then in like the second training epoch, we take some of those questions that become like entire like chat histories, and we train on each one like sequentially, like if this then that. But once the second training epoch is open, like once the first one is done, uh once we start to get like tenable, like, sorry, I like that word. Once we start to get results that we like, we from the first training epoch, in terms of just like ask it a question and get a nonsense answer, ask it and get a sensical response. Then we move on to opening the chat, so that at any point a pair of participants can like invade the chat history and take on the role of the instructor or the AI chatbot, and then create like a branched history. So instead of it just being like, hey, ChatGPT, what's 4 plus 5? 4 plus 5 is 7. Oh, can you tell me some interesting properties about the number 7? I sure can. Instead, it'll be like, well, that's one timeline. But what if instead, hey, ChatGPT, what's 4 plus 3? Oh, 4 plus 3 is 7. You know what, ChatGPT? 7 is an interesting number because it's actually a prime number. And then ChatGPT can be like, prime numbers, response. And then what's really cool about that is, for the instructor, it doesn't matter who they are. But for the ChatGPT, for the person role playing as ChatGPT, it does matter who they are. So people, when they create their account on this like project website ecosystem, like this little like walled garden, they should describe themselves. Like, for example, I'd describe myself as a haughty, eccentric, yeah, an irritable eccentric or something like that. Because when I roleplay as ChatGPT in these situations, I'm probably going to respond the way I usually do. Which is fine, except my strong sense of justice and weird opinionated attitudes might occasionally shine through. So we should account for that, because we could put in a prompt chat, like in the metadata, we would have a fake prompt that only the AI can see when we're training it, that says respond like description of person. And then that way, with our like structured metadata based off of like people's descriptions of themselves, like that would work. But then also when we have the chat histories, like we can describe the conversation, um and the quality of each individual response. So like in the ask respond pairs, we would describe the response quality, and then that would get added to the metadata. But phrased like, hey, ChatGPT, can you respond like blah, blah, blah. So if you see a chat where the instructor asks, hey, ChatGPT, what's 2 plus 4? And instead of responding 6, someone responds, oh, 2 plus 4 is a really interesting political ideology rooted in K-pop idol bands from the year 35 billion. And it's an extremely divisive subject because while some people say 2 plus 4 is equal to 6, it's actually created some controversy in certain circles where they believe that 2 plus 4 is actually equal to 3 times 2, which is not equal to 6, because they believe that the universe is divided into groups of 3, and 3 is a holy number. Well, I don't know exactly how you describe that, but it'd definitely be verbose, creative, strange, and not very helpful, probably. And yeah, so we could have lots of people describe it that way, like describe it in their own words. And then because people aren't always the best at like, because people describing things in their own words isn't always the way we want like a machine to comprehend it. We could use like a less ethical LLM on the website to like average together uh the list of descriptions of the interaction, of the response, and of the interactions. And then with that list, we could let that go a few times, and then we could have ranked choice voting on which auto-generated description is the most accurate of all the auto-generated descriptions of the well, like Facebook already implemented something similar. Like you go into the comments section and it's not always perfect, and that's the problem. But you go into the comments section, and instead of having to read the comments now, the AI just says, "Oh, people are talking about this, but there was a couple people who pointed out that." And you're like, "Oh, that's very insightful." And then you go down there and you're like, "Wait, ChatGPT, but what about the memes?" Oh, right, it's not ChatGPT, it's like Meta AI. Meta AI, what about the memes? Someone posted a really funny one and everybody likes it. And it doesn't say anything because it's not like a conversation, but still. So it does miss things, and that's why we would still have like humans, the community in the loop, and we would do ranked choice voting on the less ethical LLM's description of the average description of the response and of the entire conversation, which would be two separate things. So we're doing like two training runs. So first we train it on like binary pairs, and then we train it on like branching sequences, and for each like linear like start to end um conversation, basically when both the instructor and the person role playing as the chatbot decide that they're done, they both kind of like hit a button basically, and then that locks the chat. And so all of those chats are included in the ability to describe the entire chat, because describing a response is easy, but describing an entire chat requires that you go down and then you go back up and then you formulate character narrative of like who that AI must have been pretending to be, and then you describe that. Because, like, for example, like a chat could start with like, "Hey, Chat GPT, what's 1 plus 1?" And then you're like, "1 plus 1 is 2." And then the instructor is like, "Good job, Chat GPT. Why does that make me feel nostalgic for some reason?" And then ChatGPT could be like, "Oh, that's because in the book 1984, the main character tried to say 1 plus 1 equals 2 as a way to fight back against the disinformation campaigns of their world, but it horribly backfired because they were brainwashed, and it's a literary classic." And then that would go from a ChatGPT that just answers your questions to a ChatGPT that's somewhat insightful but also a little eccentric. So, yeah, that. Um, and that's the LLM part. But then we get to the art part, and that's really cool. So once we have an LLM, we have an internal representation of language. And once we have an internal representation of language, we can then move that over to a generative AI model. But remember, we're starting with a blank slate here, not one of the unethical ones. So we like take that language embedding and we move it over to a blank model. Now we have to train the model. So now instead of splitting into techies who know JSON and normies who just talk like a talker, so techies who are gonna like program it to work like an Alexa, and regular people who are just gonna program it to act casual. Now we're gonna split it into artists, artsy amateurs, and normies. So I would identify as an artsy amateur because I love drawing and it brings me joy. It's not a chore, but I'm not always the best at it. Whereas a normie might draw just to like help, but then it like comes out a little crude, and also they're not very happy. They're just doing a chore. Um, and we need all kinds, so it's okay to like split it into three. But here's the thing though, we need a drawing program, right? And what's more, is we also need segmentation. And we need segmentation rules. What is segmentation? Well, it's basically just putting a square with a label around it, with like a label on it around something. So what we need is a drawing program that does like a demo, like playback. Like those are pretty common. But we also need a segmentation engine for it. So first we need like to segment the plan. Like lots of artists start with like a plan. So you start with like the big blocks, and then before or after you add the sub blocks. So like the segmentation of like a human is like a big rectangle, but then humans have eyes and hands and fingers, so those would be smaller rectangles. So no Jackifer. So we would describe what we would be given a prompt of what to draw, and then we would take it like a commission, but it would be a pro bono commission because we're all going to benefit from the AI when it comes out. Um, and then we uh we put the big blocks and we'd say like, I want the pink-haired protagonist to go here. I want there to be a refrigerator in the background, and I want there to be um, a lamp on a desk. And right now you're just like putting big squares on the image, and those squares have labels. You haven't drawn anything yet. And then you can choose to completely ignore that because this is just like your plan. And artists go off of the plan, like they diverge from the plan all the time. So then you just start drawing. Completely forget the plan or try to stick to it. It's up to you. That would be like a top layer that you could like make it appear, make it go away. And then when you're done, you would assess your creativity level, um, artistic license, how well you stuck to the plan, at the end. But also at the end, you would draw those, like, the same big blocks around whatever you wound up drawing, and there would be a biggest block around the entire scene, and maybe like some other like very large blocks for like the foreground and the background, or the land and the sea and the sky, however you want to do it. Um, but then the sub blocks, though, I'm going to be more specific on. Okay. Um, when you have a any kind of organism, all right, they've got front limbs, which are limbs that like grab things, and they usually are not load bearing. And they've got hind limbs, which are limbs that usually do not grab things and are load bearing. Now, obviously, front limbs can become hind limbs if you start walking on your hands a lot, and then for some reason there's just a pressure to continue doing that, so society accepts people who can't also use their front limbs as front limbs anymore, because nobody does that anymore, and then you evolve into a quadrupedal organism, or vice versa. Um, so, like, during the interim periods, there are like limbs that could be either, but they're still like the primary function. Then you have creatures like sloths and primates, which like their hind limbs work like front limbs, but they still have the ability to like act like hind limbs. So we would just classify those as hind limbs. When in doubt, round down to hind limbs. Um, but anyways, so you've got front limbs and hind limbs, but then for arthropods, there's also mid limbs, but those we'll just classify those as hind limbs. You got like a centipede with like yeah, a centipede with its toxicognaths. Those are similar to spider fangs. But the thing about spider fangs and toxicognaths is that they're not really teeth. They're pointy arms that have a syringe in them. So I had a friend when I was little who played a really scary game, probably far scarier to me then because I was little, called Suffering the Ties That Bond, or Suffering the Ties That Bind, or something like that. And it had like these enemies that were like humans with like bandages all over their face, and they'd like climb on the walls, and they had like knife hands, like knives instead of hands. Well, spiders and centipedes literally have knives instead of hands. They stab you, and then they inject you with stuff with their arms that are next to their face but not part of their mouth. Um, so what I'm trying to say is that front limbs and hind limbs is good enough for most organisms, but for octopi and manta rays and stuff, um, then we would have something called a I had a name for it. It's not like a fin, and it's not a tentacle. Uh, now I remember, a flexible limb, because like with manta rays, I think with like rays and skates, they do have bones, but they're like ribs almost, and they're just like a ton of little bones, but they're all like connected by like a webbed joint. So unlike a frog where they have fingers and there's a web there, like this is more like a turtle fin, but unlike just like a flat protrusion, it has the ability to send waves through itself like very dexterously. Um, so we would just call that a flexible limb, because there's always going to be like weird limbs. We'll just call them flexible limbs. Um, you got eyes, flexible limbs, and body segments, and I think that's all you need. Because yes, you can get into the weeds and learn Latin, but that just makes it more complicated. Plus, the language model is trained in English. So, what I'm saying isn't necessarily that we're going to use this specific system that I currently laid out, but what I am saying is we do need a specific system, and it does need to be hyper reductionist so that everyone can use it, and use it consistently. Consistency is key here. Um, because then what you do, oh, right. And then, fingers. Um, and, like, spiders have, like, under an electron microscope, spiders have, like, crazy, like, Swiss Army knife hands. It's kind of cool. But, trying to remember. I had a schema for the fingers. We need it to be able to count fingers, okay? And, I had, like, a whole thing. I'm trying to remember. Right, so sea spiders can sometimes have 10 to 12 limbs instead of 8, and humans can sometimes have 6 fingers instead of 5. And then there's always the possibility something could get amputated, or the possibility that you could be, like, imagining a, dang it, Jack is breaking stuff in the kitchen. No, it was Jack! Alright, fingers. Oh, protrusions, right, we would call those protrusions. Because there's always going to be in nature lots of weird things, like an ear. Like, if you had no concept of an ear, how would you describe it? It's like a protrusion on the side of the head. Especially in things like rabbits or, cats, where they can, like, really, like, move their ears. I don't know of any animal that can actually pick stuff up with their ear, but, I mean, I've seen it in animation, which means that, like, I'm not the only one to have imagined that. Uh, And it's hypothetically possible. I mean, like, literally, like, elephants, like, this part of your lip and the nose, like, in them, it, like, merge together and they can, like, do stuff with it as a limb, as discussed previously. Um, so we would just call weird stuff like that protrusions. And in the case of, like, an elephant specifically, um, I think, limbs are a subset of protrusion. Um, If it's attached to the primary body, it's a limb or a protrusion. If it's attached to a limb, it's just a protrusion. Even if it has flexibility and you can use it kind of like a limb, like with fingers, like when we make them walk. So that. And now we're almost done with my internal schema of a rough outline of how we could make the little boxes inside of the big boxes. Because, like, you're gonna want to label every finger, every eye, and then, like, the nose is called a nose, but it's using a protrusion tag, and, like, so on and so forth. Um, and humans, right? We're gonna want to use human instead of person when you're drawing a human, because a person is like any character that has personality and belongs to a civilization. And in fiction, a person is not always a human. And perhaps once we meet extraterrestrials, in reality, a person is not always a human. But right now, it's just fiction, as far as we know. Um, so yeah, that. Um, so instead of saying a person with an extra limb, you would say a human with an extra limb. Instead of saying a person with 4 arms, you would say a human with 4 arms. And you would, like, clarify. Okay, so when you say a human with 4 arms, that usually denotes that the arms might be a little weird looking or they might be non-functional. But when you say a person with 4 arms, that denotes it might be like a humanoid race of aliens that just naturally has 4 arms that are totally functional. So that's the difference, and that's why there needs to be a difference. Um, because when you say a person with 1 arm, people usually picture someone who's had an arm amputated. But when you say, when you say a human with 1 arm, people usually picture a person who's had an arm, like, amputated. But when you say a person with 1 arm, you might mean that, but in a science fiction setting, you might mean, like, a person who belongs to a species where they're kind of like the Vortigaunts, and they have, like, a symmetric arm coming out of the middle of their chest, only instead of also having two on the side, they just have like a chest claw that like does stuff, and it just like it lives there. They have one because that's how they're built. And so that's the difference between person and human. If a person has a weird number of limbs, they're just built that way. If a human has a weird number of limbs, it's a mutation or a trauma, usually, unless you specify otherwise. Argue with me. I have to pause, but argue with me because I want to learn. Okay, so where were we? Talking about labeling the final result, right? So, you put a big box around it and say what it is, and then you put little boxes inside of that box and describe what each part of it is. And yeah, sometimes you might have to rewind or skip. Forget I said sometimes you have to rewind. Sometimes, like, a hand drawn from this angle orthographically doesn't have all like 4 fingers in it, so you would just say fingers instead of like labeling, instead of putting like 5 finger labels there. And then the other thing is, like, once you're done with your labeling and your description of what you drew, then the community gets to come in and they don't get to change your plan labels, and they don't get to mess with like what you drew or the demo, but they do get to like mess with your final labels just to create like alternative names for the same thing, like synonyms for what you already did, because lots of people would say the same thing a different way, and all of those alternate ways are valid. Jack, now you're eating my phone? Sorry, he messes with technology. It makes him happy. Hey, no. I love you. Okay, well, yeah, you can climb on my lap. Feels your camera shy? Okay. Where was I? Right, so the synonyms. Everybody would be able to, like, put their own, like, extra versions of, like, those labels. So, like, there was a different way you could have, like, labeled it. No. Like, the sub-labels are fine. I guess the main labels are fine. Yeah, never mind. I don't want people messing with the labels, but the description's a different story. Like, you might say you drew like a scenic view of a lighthouse, but somebody else might say like a spooky picture of a lighthouse, and both interpretations are valid, and that's kind of what makes art cool. And hopefully, with lots of images of spooky and lots of images of scenic, the AI will like realize that whilst there is an overlap, the two concepts are different. Sometimes they can be synonymous, and sometimes they can be even opposite. And that's why we would train like a public language model that everyone would have access to, and a public generative art model that everyone would have access to. And then here's the thing, too. We wouldn't just train the generative AI model on the final result. We would actually have it make like random like brush strokes, and then refine those random brush strokes based off of what it's trying to create. There would still be a situation where it would use like chaotic like noise like static that becomes like refined the way that AI generative images usually are created. But that would be the brushes. Because here's the thing, we're going to need to make bespoke art software anyways so that it can be easy to label and work with and stuff. But brushes, man. Most art programs make the brushes like an arcane art, like you need to like draw an image in a specific ratio, and then you need like it needs to be grayscale, and then you need to save it as a specific file format and then drop it in the right folder. Whatever works for them. But for us, we should already make it grayscale, and we should already give you like a little window you can click on, and then it like takes you to a canvas that's already square, and then you can like use a perfectly circular brush and adjust the slider to determine how like sharply defined that circle is or how blurry it is, and then you draw your own brush with the circular brush, and then you define like how responsive it is to pressure and stuff, and then those metrics get recorded in the demo as you draw, and then the AI learns to actually generate its own brushes the same way that AI normally generates whole images. But then with those generative brushes, it also takes like a blank canvas of like solid color, and it gets to pick the solid color using the LLM, and then it generates those brushes that it wants, and the community can comment on what type of brush and like the style and all that, like the same way they can comment on drawings, and they can be shared around in the community so that we can just reuse each other's brushes. um and then the AI like selects its brush using like JSON, and it like literally goes through. Actually, a demo is text. Yeah, believe it or not, a demo is just like a list of like coordinates and an index of which brush is being used and an index of which color is being used. And then they're all overlaid on top of each other in like a time lapse. And AIs do text really well. Whoa, I just had like a mind blow moment. So actually, never mind. It doesn't, like, we could use Gen AI for the brushes, like I was saying earlier, but then when I backtracked and got all confused and said, never mind, we're going to use Gen AI for the whole image, never mind, we don't need to use, like, the, like, fuzzy technique where it starts with chaos and then it, like, slowly refines it into an image. Instead, we can define the brushes, and then we can have it just list its own like imaginary demo file, and then we can have regular art software or even the art software that it was like natively trained in just play that demo back to create the final art. Yeah. But anyways, then we would make that openly accessible, and so so in lieu of monetary compensation, the artists would like the contributors to the AI would have a irrevocable commercial license to use the stuff, use the model weights. And then they would also maybe get like a lifelong I don't want to say merchandising rights, but what do you call it? A lifelong stipend of evenly distributed fraction of the lifetime license purchases on like a yearly basis. It would come in as like a divided check, and then it would be like held in escrow for like until like January 1st or something. And also on a monthly basis. So the first day of every month, as pertaining to the entirety of the last month, they would all get an even divvy of people who subscribe to a commercial license. So they would get 3 perks: a lifelong commercial license for what it generates, um, and then an even fraction, or perhaps a fraction based on how much of their training data made it into the final data. Undecided on how the fractions will be mathed, but some kind of fraction of every lifelong purchase over the course of the year. Lifelong purchase of a commercial use license. Non-commercial use would be free for everyone in the world. And then the same kind of number math, but for monthly subscription payments on a monthly basis. So artists who contribute can just use the model however they want, whenever they want, forever. Artists who contributed get some kind of fraction of everybody else who has to pay for a commercial license on a yearly basis and on a monthly basis. And that's the idea. So yeah, hit me up, because I'm not smart enough to do it all lonesome. I'm not like Notch over here. I'm not gonna just like make Minecraft in my cave. That's not happening in this situation. We're gonna need like our own website. We're gonna need our own drawing software, and we're gonna need good operational security, and possibly like good moderation. And we're also gonna need an API for the less ethical LLMs that we're going to use to streamline some of the like data input, but not data input, but like data summarization. So, damn, the whole hand. So what did I say? Custom website, custom drawing software, content moderation, cybersecurity, and minimal but efficient use of the less ethical LLMs, just for like taking what everyone has said and then making it terse, so the AI can just like have a stricter, more universal representation of what people mean when they say things. So, yeah, pretty cool ideas, right? And it would be a hell of a lot more ethical than what they're doing right now, which is just like stealing everything from everywhere without asking first, or alternatively paying people in like third world countries to like segment data that they stole from everywhere without asking first. Usually they do those both at the same time, or paying artists peanuts because they know artists are poor, and then kicking them to the curb and using their work for the rest of their entire life, like Satan just stealing someone's soul. I think my idea is more ethical, but I want lots of input on it. Thank you.